Back again with another camera review. I thought we'd take a look at the Nikon Z6. This has become a more popular camera on the used market these days thanks to its relatively low price point. I will timestamp the video, so do feel free to jump around to areas that would interest you. Looking at the design of the body, we're starting off at the top. Most of the construction on this camera is metal, and that includes the mode dial. Very solid feeling camera in the hand, and that's unfortunately something we're probably not going to see much of because the newer models are mostly plastic now. On the right hand side, a cluster of 3 buttons next to the OLED display. There's your front and rear dials. I find the display on this to be quite clear, but it isn't that easy to see in very bright light. The display will vary depending on which buttons you press, but for some reason it doesn't give you any indication of the white balance setting. It's still quite useful to have a top display, particularly if you're carrying it around or it's on a tripod. Back of the camera is dominated by the 3.2 inch LCD. Top left we have the play and delete buttons. The only other control is for the viewfinder and the LCD. You can switch between the two or have it on auto setting. As with many mirrorless cameras, you do get a clustering of controls, mostly on the right hand side. Not a lot of space between them. We have a combination of directional pad and a joystick. There's an AF on button and a display in the middle of the switch between the video and stills. Very much standard sort of connections for this type of a camera. We do have the microphone and headphone port, as well as the USB-C, mini HDMI and the accessory terminal. There's your AF assist light. Unfortunately it's a green light and it's a bit annoying, to be honest. I usually just turn that off. Front is dominated with the large diameter lens mount, and we have 2 function buttons. The front control dial is made out of plastic, slightly different design to the DSLRs we've seen from Nikon. Onto the underside, your tripod socket, which is, as with most mirrorless cameras, positioned forward. And opening up the battery compartment, this camera shipped with the B-type battery. And there are weather seals on the battery compartment. You can see that rubber seal around the lip. Open up the memory card on the right hand side, Compact Flash Express or XQD. And I think it was a mistake really for Nikon to go with a single card slot and an expensive media card slot at that. Though the cost of the cards today aren't too bad, at the time they were pretty expensive, and I don't think that that was a good move from Nikon. We have a flip LCD on this. The articulation is quite good. If you're pointing it upwards, it actually tilts a bit further back than many of the designs I've seen. The downside to this is around about 45 degrees tilting down, so that's not as much as I'd like, but the viewing angles are quite good on the display. And because it has touch functionality, you can control all of the settings and menus just by pressing the touchscreen. You can go into the menus and scroll around if you wish, and they're pretty standard Nikon menus that we've seen over quite a few different cameras. They are starting to get a bit too dense in terms of the settings that you have. You can use the D-pad as well if you want, or you can set the joystick in the settings to control the menus, or you can just leave it to control the autofocus. I think most people will be quite happy with the level of customization with this camera. It's reasonably intuitive to use. It will probably take you a while to get things set up, but once you have it as you want, it's pretty intuitive in terms of using the camera. You will be using that panel quite a bit though. Have a quick look at the autofocus modes. We have quite a few here, including a pinpoint AF. That particular one uses a contrast detect system. It gives you a very small focus point. It's only available in AFS mode. It's useful for macro, but I don't use it that often. You can of course just press the screen to control the focus points. There is a tracking mode on this, and it's pretty similar to the D780. In other words, it's okay for subjects that aren't moving that quickly. I personally don't use it for anything where there's fast action. I don't think it's responsive enough. But it's still of some use, particularly for people walking and moving around or portraits. One of the criticisms of this camera when it was first released was that the focus performance wasn't really as good as it should have been. Over a period of time, Nikon have updated the firmware significantly with this camera, and it's certainly a lot better than it was years ago. It still has a few quirks which I will mention later on. There are some limitations with the focus system, particularly with the IAF. That is only available when you are in one mode, and that mode is the auto area AF. but you cannot use it in video mode. You only go to the face detection for that. Electronic viewfinder on this camera is actually quite good. It's quite a big magnification, 0.8 times. Indoors it does gain up, so that's quite useful. Outside doesn't really have the details to a level which I would say it's competitive with an optical viewfinder. If there's one major drawback with this electronic viewfinder, it's that when you start panning around the shots, you can see that there is stuttering. This makes using the camera for action shots a bit harder because it can be a little bit disorientating when you see that. Battery can be charged in the camera, but you can't power it on when you are charging it. That's one limitation. As far as the high ISO performance, there's really not that much to be unhappy with this camera. It does a very decent job even at fairly high ISO levels. I would normally set this to around about 6,400 or maybe 12,800. I would still find that level very usable in terms of the image quality. You can get away with slightly higher than that, although you will have to put a bit of work in at, say, ISO 25,600. Above that level, I really don't think the images are going to be that useful. As far as the metering performance, in most situations I didn't have any issues. There's the usual slight underexposure with very bright subjects or slight overexposure with very dark ones. If you look at the dynamic range, the BSI sensor is well known for its very good dynamic range, particularly in the shadow areas. You can do some quite aggressive shadow pulling. But unfortunately, sometimes you can see a problem with the phase detect AF banding. It's the masking that Nikon have used on this model and the Z7, which means to say that in some situations you can see some horizontal stripes going across the images. I don't see this very often, but it's typically when you're doing fairly strong shadow pulling in some situations. Here's a sample from DP Review when they did their review on the camera. This isn't what I would call an extreme processing push. I lifted it about 3 stops in the shadows, and you can see that banding pattern going across on the girders. There is a way to get around this if you're using raw therapy. This does have a filter which can remove that banding pattern. It's worth mentioning because you can sometimes see it, but generally speaking, I don't find it to be a huge issue. Let's talk about the focus performance. Typically, I tend to use this in single point or the dynamic area AF. And that gives you your 9 focus points. It's a fairly large area. It's similar to the DSLR version, although you can't change the number of points. Typically, I find the performance to be pretty good, though occasionally it can be slightly off. This is a typical sort of performance that you get. It will vary depending on the lens. I'm certainly not unhappy with the focus performance with regards to single point or the dynamic area AF. The wide area modes, I don't really use those that much. On the Z6 II, they did add the eye detect for that. You do have animal eye AF. This was added via firmware. But unfortunately, you have to select that from the menus in the same way that you do with the face and eye detection. A few samples now that I'm showing you. Typically, I've been using the camera for things like events and some running marathons, and I really haven't had any major issues in terms of focus or exposure. The electronic shutter is perfectly usable for this type of movement. If you're using the 12-bit RAW, you get a faster readout speed. I think it's around about 1/38th of a second. But that's about as fast as you'll be able to use it for. Anything quicker, such as fast action or motorsports or ice hockey, you wouldn't be able to use the electronic shutter, but it's certainly very usable in a way that the Z5 wasn't, that has a much slower readout speed. Something to think about if you were considering different model options. That was a shutter sound demonstration. You can shoot this at 5.5 frames per second, lossless RAW unlimited with a fast compact flash express card. There are some limitations depending on the modes that you're in. So to get your 12 frames a second, you do need to be in 12-bit RAW. Don't find that to be a problem myself. I'm not the best person to talk about video. There are many more people out there who know much more about it. I've never been unhappy with the quality that I've had from the video, even in low light at a high ISO. It's very competitive, perhaps slightly better than cameras such as the Sony a7 III. It will do 10-bit and you can get raw video if you have the paid upgrade. Let's talk about strange things with this camera. Here's an example with the focus system in Auto Area AF. The camera decides where to focus in this mode automatically. But as you can see in this example, it's focusing on the road in front of the car, and it doesn't even lock onto the car until it drives into the focus points. Most cameras I've used, even really old cameras, say 20 years ago, would pretty much always default to a middle area or the closest obvious subject to you. But the Z6 for some reason just picks strange and weird places to focus sometimes with the Auto Area AF. Similar story in AFS, it will sometimes pick something on the side or in the background and focus on that. Only time I use the Auto Area AF is when there's a person or I want to use the eye detect feature. Would have liked a larger OLED panel, and also the rear control dial. There's no markings on it, so there's no real reason to have that exposed. The covers are sort of a flexible plastic, but they feel quite cheap in what is an otherwise quite well made camera. They seem to be prone to warping or going out of shape and expanding over time. And likewise, we also have the Nikon rubber issue, which has returned. Earlier production cameras seem to have some problems with the rubber coming off in layers. That seems to have been a quality problem, although later ones that does seem to have been fixed. I don't mind the location of the play and delete, but they have changed that on the newer cameras. I do miss some classic Nikon ergonomics. The drive dial, which sits below the main exposure dial on the DSLRs, isn't present. I find that very useful, and it would have freed up a button on the back of the camera. I also miss the controls on the right hand side. We don't have anything for the flash, or some models had a bracketing button there. The function buttons near the grip are quite good. I prefer the position to be slightly higher up though. Most people tend to configure those for the focus modes. I do prefer the rubber dials, but this one is plastic. It's not a big problem, just takes a bit of getting used to with the overall feel. And Nikon keep moving this exposure compensation button. It's quite far over on the right and it's sort of recessed. They've now moved that back, perhaps a bit too far on the newer models. I think the position on the D780, which is shown here, that's the best place for that button. Seems like a small point, but these ergonomic things do add up. Memory card door sort of sticks out a bit and can sometimes be knocked open by accident. Not sure why Nikon didn't put a normal memory card door on the side. It's a very small point to make, but it is something which can be a little bit annoying over time. I do like the fact that you have that separate switch for the stills and the video mode. Unfortunately, there's no AF assist light with the flash guns, and that includes the Nikon ones as well. This did ship with the B-type battery, but the C1 will give you around about 20% more battery capacity. Battery life is pretty modest, to be honest. You will find that you're probably going to be getting around about double those SIPA figures. But it's worth diving into the menus to change a few settings, such as an airplane mode. You can adjust the monitor brightness. Unfortunately, it's only a manual adjustment. It doesn't have a sensor for that. And some of the power saving settings can make quite a big difference. With mirrorless cameras, it's really the screen time and on time which drains the battery. Nikon did make a battery power pack, but it is just a battery pack. It isn't a grip. If you want that functionality, you'll have to get the Z6 II. It's a very adaptable lens mount. You can even fit E-mount lenses on this camera. And it's a decent affordable platform for manual focus lenses. You have a few focus aids such as the peaking. You can also put the lens data into the camera manually, such as the focal length and the aperture. You'll be able to use the image stabilization in camera, although I believe it drops down to 3-axis. Very good stabilizer performance with this camera. They quote 5 stops. It works very well in my experience. Depending on what you're using it for, it could be a pretty good value option. Typical price on this is a fair bit less than something like a Sony a7 III. The cameras are quite comparable in terms of the image quality and video output. Really comes down to if that single card slot or the choice of media is a problem for you, because that does add a bit of cost to the overall package. Be very interested to hear your thoughts on this camera. If you have any, do drop them down below. Hopefully, I'll see you in my next video, and thanks for watching.